for spacious skies, or amber waves of grain, for purple mountain majesties above the fruited plain. America, America, God shed His grace on thee.
When Martin Luther King's inspirational leadership and peaceful ways of solving problems has set the foundation for us, that we are able today to witness the fruits of his labor. Martin Luther King wanted people to be able to go places together, share food together, and love one another in peace. He worked so hard for freedom and helped so many people gain it. I can today rejoice in our sufferings because we know that sufferings produce perseverance, faith, character, hope, gentleness, and love. We love because God first loved us. Thank you.
Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15, 1929 at 501 Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, Georgia. His father was a Baptist minister and his mother was a musician. His childhood was not especially eventful. He grew up as the second of 3 children in a black neighborhood, attending all black schools. At 19, he graduated in 1959 from Morehouse College in Atlanta. Before he turned 27, he had earned 2 other degrees, a B.D. from Crozier Theological Seminary and a Ph.D. in Systematic Theology from Boston University. From the time that he and his bride, the former Coretta Scott, moved to Montgomery, Alabama to accept the pastorate of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in 1954, King was destined to play an important role in the history of the United States. The year after he arrived in Montgomery, Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to move to the back of the bus, and a support group that was organized to defend her and to boycott the bus company chose King as its leader. Soon his eloquent voice on behalf of the disadvantaged was heard not only in Montgomery, but in many parts of the United States and ultimately around the world.
We are not wrong in what we are doing. If we are wrong, the Supreme Court of this nation is wrong. If we are wrong, the Constitution of the United States is wrong. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong.
Perhaps King was always committed to nonviolence, but his visit to India in 1957 and his personal encounter with Prime Minister Nehru and with Indian teachings of nonviolence strengthened his resolve to use them in his quest for radical justice. This resolve is set forth in his first book, Stride Toward Freedom, an account of the successful Montgomery bus boycott. It was evident by 1958 that King's activities in the movement to secure equal rights interfered with his pastoral duties. He was traveling constantly, and his association with other such leaders as A. Philip Randolph, Whitney Young, and Roy Wilkins required regular meetings. Consequently, in 1960, King resigned his pastorate in Montgomery, moved to Atlanta, and became president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, a new but rapidly growing civil rights organization committed to nonviolence. Increasingly, King advocated and practiced civil disobedience to what he termed immoral laws. In 1960, he was sentenced to 4 months in Reidsville State Prison in Georgia for allegedly trespassing at a department store in Atlanta and for violating probation for a traffic violation several months earlier. Because of widespread fears for his safety in Reidsville, his jailing became an issue in the presidential election when Democratic candidate John F. Kennedy expressed his concern to Mrs. King, while Republican candidate Richard M. Nixon did not. In the next few years, King intensified his drive for equal rights, staging boycotts in Albany, Georgia in 1961 and 1962, and in Birmingham, Alabama in the spring of 1963. There were violent responses from parts of the public as well as from the police, as homes and churches were bombed and civil rights workers were murdered. Meanwhile, King urged his followers to practice nonviolence as they committed acts of civil disobedience. King himself was arrested and jailed.
Growing up, I learned about Dr. King's contributions to the civil rights movement, for example, the Montgomery bus boycott and the March on Washington. Of course, I felt great respect for someone who was willing to commit his life to helping others. It wasn't until I was in college, however, that I discovered his involvement in less well-known events, for example, those that unfolded in Birmingham, Alabama during 1963. During the Birmingham movement, thousands of children, some in elementary school, others high school aged, marched for equal rights and were jailed and attacked by police dogs and fire hoses as a result. Dr. King's efforts at this time were both inspiring and thought-provoking. If Dr. King and students as young as elementary school were willing to get involved despite challenges and threats to their personal safety, what must conditions have been like? What impact could this generation's young people have on society today if they demonstrated the same courage, determination, and self-sacrifice as the participants of the civil rights movement? This question piqued my interest and created in me a desire to learn more and to share this information with others. In 1998, I had the good fortune to travel to several historic sites in the civil rights movement where Dr. King worked to end racism. Specifically, I traveled to Montgomery, Birmingham, and Atlanta.
When 8 prominent white Birmingham clergymen, in a statement called An Appeal for Law and Order and Common Sense, criticized blacks for disobeying the law, King felt obliged to respond. An individual who breaks the law that conscience tells him is unjust and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice, said King in his letter from Birmingham jail, is in reality expressing the highest respect for the law.
For years now, I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see with one of our distinguished jurists that justice too long delayed is justice denied.
On August 28, 1963, more than 250,000 people of every race and creed marched on Washington. Leaders met with President Kennedy and several spoke to the crowds. King electrified the audience with his famous I Have a Dream speech.
Let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring when the capital beats. When we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
My grandparents had been down to Georgia visiting friends a few weeks before Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech. And I was up at the house when he gave his momentous speech, and we watched it together. And I had, I guess, a special insight into the speech because of my grandparents' experiences while they were in Georgia. I remember they were telling me about how beautiful the state was, the mountains, and Stone Mountain in particular. But I also remember an incident where my grandparents had seen some demonstrators before a restaurant demonstrating for the simple right to, eat at a restaurant with whites, and they were arrested brutally by the police. They were set upon by German shepherds. They were cursed at. They were beaten, and they were dragged, off into paddy wagons. And my grandmother was talking about it, and as she talked about it, she got so angry, her eyes filled up with tears. And this was, you know, a couple of weeks after the incident had occurred. And I remember that my grandfather had to calm her down, and he said, if you think I had to calm down your Nana right now, just imagine what she was like when she was, you know, seeing this. My grandfather said that she got so angry at, you know, what she saw that he had to tell her that, you know, to shut up and, you know, don't engage the police because you might get hauled off too. And it made a real impression on me. It was the first time that I remember my grandparents commenting on the momentous civil rights struggles that were going on in the, you know, early 60s. And I felt good that, you know, my grandparents had been so moved by this and were so outraged by the incident. And then, of course, when Martin Luther King gave his speech, he talked about letting freedom ring, and he talked about letting freedom ring from Stone Mountain. And I thought to myself that maybe someday I'll see Stone Mountain, because my grandparents had described how beautiful it was. And then years later, when I was in the Soviet Union in 1988-89, I was going to the Lenin Library to do some research, and 6 brave Soviet Jews were standing in front of the library with placards asking for permission for the right to emigrate to Israel. And I saw something very similar to what my grandmother had seen. The German shepherds were not there, but the police pulled up. They broke the placards that the Jews were carrying. They cursed at them. They called them traitors, and they hauled them off into their police cars. And I thought to myself, I thought about Martin Luther King then, and I thought about my grandmother and grandfather then, because I had experienced something similar. I had seen a group of demonstrators being brutally arrested, you know, by the police, simply in this case for the right to emigrate, which you know, any free people has. And then finally, just last spring, I made it to the great peach state of Georgia. And I ate in many restaurants and made it to Stone Mountain. And while I was in Georgia, I met all kinds of people, and I talked with all kinds of people. And I had wondered how different the state was from what my grandparents had seen 30-some years earlier. And there was no tension, apparent tension between whites and blacks, and everybody seemed to, you know, get along peaceably. And it made me think about how horrible those years were, and what great price that people had to pay, being beaten, being set upon by dogs, being jailed even, just for simple basic, you know, human rights that white Americans, you know, had taken for granted for a couple of hundred years. And when I got to Stone Mountain especially, it is most beautiful. And I really thought of Martin Luther King's speech at that time as well, and my grandparents' experiences at that time, because he talks in his speech about letting freedom ring, and he uses Stone Mountain as a metaphor in his speech, letting freedom ring even from Stone Mountain. And I wished too, when I was on top of Stone Mountain looking out at the beautiful surroundings, that freedom could ring from Stone Mountain.
It was a momentous year for King. In December, Time magazine chose him as its Man of the Year. The following year, at the insistence of King and his followers, and with the prodding of President Lyndon B. Johnson, Congress passed the first civil rights bill since 1875. In autumn of 1964, King was awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace.
I accept the Nobel Prize for Peace at a moment when 22 million Negroes of the United States are engaged in a creative battle to end the long night of racial injustice.
It was perhaps the events of the preceding year, as well as his hopes for the future, that moved King to write in 1964 his second book, Why We Can't Wait. Even as he explained why blacks could not wait, roadblocks were clearly visible. The march from Selma to Montgomery in March of 1965 to press for a voting rights bill was almost stalled as the opposition gained strength. By this time, some segments of the civil rights movement began to lose confidence in nonviolence as a means of achieving equality.
We must come to see that the end we seek